Hello and welcome to Classically Imperfect, a mental health organization dedicated to helping young classical musicians experiencing mental health distress. I'm Mary Elizalde, one of the co-founders and the director of operations, and today I'm joined by Dr. Kensley Behel, a classical clarinetist and musician's health expert. Today we will be discussing music performance anxiety and what it means as a classical musician. Hi, Dr. Behel, how are you?
I'm well. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
My first question for you is, can you describe your musical background and how you got involved into music and your path into musician's wellness?
Yeah, absolutely. So I got started in music as I think most children do. Their parents put them in piano lessons. And then when I got into junior high, I decided to join band, and the director picked out clarinet for me, which ended up being a really good fit. And I, from like pretty early on, was like, I'm going to play clarinet the rest of my life. It's the greatest thing ever. And I had my solo debut at the Jacksonville Symphony Orchestra when I was 18. And I have this really vivid memory of just like looking out across the audience and thinking, like, this is what I'm going to do the rest of my life. And sometimes, like, life just doesn't work out exactly how you expect it to. And so, into my undergraduate career, I ended up having a nasal air leak that's called stress velopharyngeal insufficiency, which is an obnoxiously long word that really just means that your soft palate doesn't work correctly. And I ended up having to have surgery for that. And then coming out of surgery, I wasn't able to produce what's called the post-vocalic R. So I had the illusion of a British accent, and I had to go through speech therapy to recorrect my voice. And then that surgery and the therapy that followed it was gave me the opportunity to publish an article in a journal and then present our research at the American Speech Language Hearing Association. And so that really just sort of like I felt like I got bit by the bug of research and wanting to help people understand musicians' health problems. And then eventually I got into a PhD program with a focus in performing arts health and was able to dive more into how to actually do hands-on research. And one of my main like passion projects is teaching musicians about the latest research and putting it into an easy to understand way.
That's great. I had no idea of that part of your background, but it's so cool to see how life can take you in really different directions. Next question for you is, what is music performance anxiety? Most musicians might have heard of this before, like me in the past, but don't really understand what it means or how to address it. Can you tell us a little bit more?
Yeah, for sure. So music performance anxiety actually falls under the greater arch of performance anxiety, which is actually a diagnosable condition in what's called the DSM-5, which is the diagnostic manual for clinical psychologists and psychiatrists to give diagnoses. So it's actually a diagnosable condition. And music performance anxiety is sort of the fight or flight event that happens in our body when we get ready to perform. And this is actually a good thing that happens that I think a lot of people don't understand is good, but it shows that our body is actually working because that mechanism is there for if we encounter a scary environment and we need to be able to utilize our resources to maybe flee a situation. But the problem is that our body conflates performance with like an actually like a really scary situation. And we have to sort of tell our body like it's okay, like we're not about to be killed, or nothing bad is actually about to happen. And so when this happens, when this arousal happens, it can happen in one of two ways. It can happen either cognitively or somatically. And what that means in like layman's terms is it can either happen in the brain or it can happen in the body. So the most common symptoms that we often see associated with music performance anxiety are things like that butterflies in the stomach or maybe a little bit of shakiness. But it can also be negative thoughts, so telling yourself beforehand, "I'm gonna fail, I'm not good enough," having those negative ruminating thoughts. or it can even be something as having to go number 2 to the bathroom, and I think that's something that, like, people really shy away from, but it actually is a really common symptom of, "Oh my gosh, I have to go to the bathroom right before I'm about to perform," and that would be an example of a body symptom or a somatic symptom of music performance anxiety.
Yeah, when can you tell a difference between, because like you said, it's normal and it's a positive thing for it to happen. When do you draw the line that it's something that shouldn't happen, or it's starting to negatively affect you? Because I know everyone experiences music performance anxiety. It's a part of being a classical musician, really any musician. But when is it like, a point where it's more harmful than good?
Yeah, it's a really, really good question. When you have music performance anxiety, what's happening at the start is a type of arousal. And what's really closely related to music performance anxiety is excitement. And so a lot of people conflate music performance anxiety actually with excitement because what's the first question you're usually asked when you're little is someone goes, "Oh, are you so nervous?" And maybe they weren't nervous, but they start putting those thoughts into their brain.
Mhm.
And so a heightened state of arousal or a positive arousal or excitement is a good thing. And there's actually research out of Harvard that looked at singing karaoke and they broke different people up into different groups. And they had one group say, "Oh, I'm excited to perform." And then they had a control group that didn't say anything beforehand. And then they had another experimental group that they said, "I'm anxious beforehand." Well, what do you think happened? The group that said, "I'm anxious," they performed worse and they didn't enjoy their performance as much. Whereas the group that said, "I'm excited," they not only enjoyed their performance more, but they actually performed better as well. And so I think a key piece of the music performance anxiety and understanding when it's a good versus a bad thing is where is that state of arousal? Is it excitement and a happiness to share the music that you have been working on? Or is it highly fear based and is it affecting your life in a negative way? And are you consistently scared to perform? Or are you scared of the judgment that's going to happen? And I think when it moves into a place where you have so much fear or debilitating anxiety, that is the point where maybe you want to uh, have a medical professional step in and help you, and that can look like many different things. It can look like therapy, it can look like EMDR, it can look like medication, it can look like something as simple as learning to retrain your brain instead of saying, "Oh my gosh, I'm so anxious," to "I am excited to perform this." And so there are many different ways to sort of mitigate music performance anxiety when it does reach that negative state.
And what are some healthy coping mechanisms musicians can incorporate into their lives to help cope with music performance anxiety? I know we've talked about how it's normal, but at the same time, is there anything that we can do to help eliminate it when it's like you're about to perform and you don't have any time to really analyze your emotions? Like, is there any specific routines that help you, or an exercise or anything?
Yeah, there are so many different ways to help with music performance anxiety, and many as with most anything, there are negative and positive consequences to each of them, so you just sort of have to balance, like, the reward versus the risk. So, one of the ones that is obviously less risky is being able to tell yourself, "I'm excited," and that does take some training to do. It's not always so easy for people to implement, so beforehand saying, "I am excited to go do this," and talk about the things you're able to share. Another one is actually anger. So that's another high arousal emotion. But I actually had a professor who would try and agitate their students before going to perform because if the student was angry, they weren't actually nervous. And again, like, right, we have to be careful when playing with anger, but I think that that's an interesting idea of high arousal. Another one is that I absolutely love is this idea called zooming out. So there's a researcher from the University of Michigan called Ethan Cross, and he does a lot of research on this idea called chatter. And he defines chatter as the negative rumination that happens in our brain. And it often happens from this. idea that you want to create self-introspection, but when looking specifically at music of how can I do better? How can I reach toward perfect? Or how can I impress X, Y, and Z person? That desire to become better actually becomes our worst enemy and our worst critic. And it becomes, I'm not good enough, or I haven't practiced enough, or, and it's so on and so forth. And so he uses this tool called Zoom Out, which means exchanging the first person for the third person. So instead of saying, like, I'm not good enough, I haven't practiced enough, I'm not worthy enough to be here, you take your name instead and say, like, Kensley, you are spiraling, or Kensley, you are prepared. Kensley, you're going to do great. And the reason that this works is because we as human beings often give much better advice to other people than we ever give to ourselves. And we also say much nicer things to other people than we say, like the things that we say to ourselves, we would never say to another human being, or at least I hope we would never say to another human being. And so using this idea of using our name, saying like, Mary, you're doing a great job, you're prepared, it helps snap you out of that rumination cycle and sort of like brings you back down to earth. So those are a couple of my favorite tools.
Yeah, definitely. Musicians especially judge themselves, especially when we make like one little mistake or like, oh darn, I could have gotten that. But we just get really into our heads, which keeps us from moving on and like, really understanding that it's okay to make mistakes. And thank you for that. Can you tell us a little bit about your career in performing arts health? What did this experience teach you more about music performance anxiety and other obstacles musicians face?
Yeah, I'm really thankful for the time that I had to study for performing arts health. It's an up and coming field, and I would say anyone who's interested in this area should absolutely pursue it because we need more people either on the research side and on the practitioner side. So if someone's more interested in like psychology or becoming a medical doctor or a physical therapist or anything like that, we need people who are informed about musicians' health problems to help the musicians themselves. Um, but that being said, yes, of course, like deep diving into the literature and being able to create research myself, I, of course, spent more time understanding musicians' health problems and mental health problems. One of my specialties is burnout, which is not a diagnosable condition in the United States, but is a diagnosable condition in many areas of the world. And, we learn about hard topics that also affect other areas of our health. So, with performance anxiety, we know from the research that one of the most common ways that people address music performance anxiety is by practicing more. But then if you start practicing more, then you start having to worry about overuse injuries and musculoskeletal problems. And we know that anxiety creates a lot of tension in the body, which again puts more stress on the body and is going to put you more at risk for musculoskeletal issues. So it's this constant balance between all the different ways that life intersects. And it comes from this model called the biopsychosocial model. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it's this three-pronged approach that says, from developed by George Engel in the 1970s, and he said, like, at the center of our health are biological issues, our psychological issues, and our social issues. So, for example, women are more likely to incur injuries than men, and one of the reasons that is that instruments were standardized at a time where men were professional musicians. And so ergonomically, they are not designed for female bodies. And there was some research done at the University of North Texas that looked at creating a smaller keyboard. And they found that female musicians had less pain and less injuries when playing on the smaller keyboard. So that's an example of a biological model. Okay, so then we have, the psychological model. So if you have ADHD or if you have negative beliefs or anxiety or trauma, like any of those things can contribute to you having more health problems. And then there's the social issues, like what are your beliefs? Well, for example, clarinetists, a lot of them believe that using a neck strap is cheating, but we know from the research that using a neck strap actually alleviates the force vectors on the right wrist, and therefore it can be a positive solution for musculoskeletal injuries. Or Another social example is, do you come from a rich family or do you come from a poor family? Like, do you actually have access to medical care to take care of your body? And so all of these things together, they create a healthy or an unhealthy musician.
Definitely. I never really thought about like the anatomy of an instrument and how it was made for a man, and that could explain so many issues that people face today. A lot of our current members actually are injured, and it's due to a multitude of things. One of them is a lot of us are preparing for college auditions right now because we're all high school seniors. So we all know junior and senior year of high school, every musician who is interested in going into music starts practicing so much more, and sometimes really unhealthy amounts, like 4 or 5 hours straight, which puts a lot of strain on all of your body. Do you have any tips for musicians? Because I was looking through your website and I saw that you were injured in the past too. This is kind of like a side question though. Do you still play clarinet or?
I do, yeah, not as often. I've actually been getting more into singing lessons. I needed to take some time away from clarinet after finishing my master's because at that point I realized that having a professional career was probably not viable for me, just based on numerous different circumstances. And I think when your identity is so closely enmeshed in being a clarinetist, like that's how I was known, that I really needed to take some time away to figure out who I was outside of that. But in the last probably 6 or so months, I have been playing more, and I would like to get back to playing professionally, but I definitely need to practice a little bit more for that to happen.
But yeah, that's also an issue that a lot of musicians have. They think that they're tied into this one identity of like their own instrument, when really musicians should have other passions and other interests, just in case it doesn't work out. And also to keep your mind occupied, not just on music 24/7, because as much as music is amazing, your brain kind of needs a little bit of a break from that.
I was just gonna add that there's research from athletes, actually. There's this athlete identity measurement scale, and what they found was that athletes who more closely identified as an athlete, if they got injured, they actually struggled a lot more with anxiety and depression because they could no longer do the sport that they most closely identified with. And I think there is some early research now being done on musician identity for musicians, and I'm really interested to see if they have the same findings as they did for athletes.
Do you have any tips for musicians who are currently injured? Is there anything that you did when you were injured that kind of helped you get away from that mindset of being in a dark place? Because I know that's what happens for a lot of musicians. Like they're on the track of being a professional musician and like going to conservatory, and then they get injured, and it's kind of like your brain falls down into this dark area, and sometimes most musicians don't know how to get out of it. Do you have any tips for maybe like mental practice or something that you did that helped you?
Yeah, it's such a great question. So I there's going to be several different answers, so I'll try and hit on a couple of the most common ones. So the first one that I would say is one of the key reasons that musicians get injured is actually repertoire. So there's this violinist that was called Maya Shankar, and she was a violinist in the pre-college program at Juilliard, and she was studying with Itzhak Perlman and was playing a Paganini caprice and actually tore a tendon off of her hand. She was only 13 when she was playing this. And what a lot of people don't know, but is actually common knowledge, is that Paganini had a hypermobility disorder, and Paganini was writing music for himself. And so he's writing music for a grown man with an unusually large reach with a hypermobility disorder. And now we're asking high school students to play this music. And you could say the same for basically any instrument. In flute, there are it's the Iber like flute concerto, right? Which was created for some of the top musicians in the world. And now we're asking high school students to play this music. And so I think that there is not appropriate scaffolding and timing for musicians to learn this music and to understand that bodies take time to develop and grow and to build strength. And so If there is a choice in music that you are allowed to play for auditions, I always say go with the one that feels the best with your body. If you do get into college or if you're doing a senior recital or something like that, I always tell teachers and students as well to be advocates and to allow the musician to play the piece of music that is healthy for their body. And if you think of like a gymnast, right? When a gymnast is constructing a routine, there's so many different ways that they could construct a routine and be the best in the world. We have Simone Biles, who's an absolute powerhouse and so utilizes high level tumbling to her advantage. But we also have gymnasts like from the Netherlands, like a gymnast called Sanne Wevers, who is much more like flexible and graceful. And so she utilizes a lot more like turns that aren't quite as hard and having a high impact on the body, but both have been Olympic champions.
Mhm.
So you just work and utilize what works with your body. So that is my first tip is like be aware of the repertoire that you're playing and know that not every piece of music, whether it's quote unquote standard or not, is actually appropriate for everybody.
Mhm.
Um, the second thing I would say in regards to injury is you should know about when to stop practicing. So there's this idea called the time to fatigue scale. And when you first start out playing, like immediately, you should feel ease. It should not hurt right off the bat. It should feel very easy to you. And then you're going to move into a session of fatigue, and fatigue is okay. So think about if you're learning how to lift weights or you're learning how to do the splits or you're learning any new skill, it's uncomfortable. And uncomfortable is okay. Pain is not. After you get to that fatigue, then you get into tension, and tension is when you have to stop playing because tension creates problems in the body, which is going to lead to pain, which leads to injury. So, if you are currently injured, the time that that ease may only be like 5 minutes. And I know that that's so frustrating to hear, but if you continue to play through the tension and into the pain, you are going to end up with long term injuries that mean you're gonna have to take significant amounts of time off. The third and final thing I'll say is rest is so important. And, everyone says this, but they don't often have practical tips for how to implement it. So, one way that I implement rest is I take a full 24 hours every week and I don't have any work obligations. I don't practice. I go do the other things that I enjoy, like hiking or skiing or reading a book. And I just completely put all work and music aside.
Mhm.
And that is what's helpful for me. And a lot of people are like, oh, I could never take a full 24 hours off. And I'm like, okay, fine. Take 6 hours off. Like, tell yourself for these 6 hours, like maybe you're an Instagram influencer. So turn off your phone or, whatever is rest for you, do it. Like Hillary Hahn, she takes a full like year sabbatical it's like 7 or 10 years. The group Pentatonics, like they have 1 day a week where they don't do performances. Like you can still be wildly successful and still prioritize rest. And I think people in music have this mindset of like, oh, I'll rest when I'm dead or I'll rest when I win a certain job or this, that, and the other. And I'm like, no, 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 you have to rest now. So yeah, those are my three key tips for musicians who are injured.
Thank you. This is kind of like a side question. Do you have any tips for musicians who want to pursue another field? Like me personally, right now, I'm thinking of double majoring in psychology and violin performance. I just love like the psychology behind music and like the mental health aspect of classical musicians and stuff. And right now I'm working with my youth orchestra on how to like the student voice of younger musicians and how to implement that. Do you have any tips for research and just like different career paths that musicians want to take?
Yeah. Oh, I love this question so much. The first thing is if you do want a double major, please don't feel pressured to finish in 4 years. Like make sure you enjoy, not like you, but like the
Yeah.
proverbial you, enjoys college and does have time to rest and rejuvenate mental health because
Mhm.
so many musicians are passionate and want to pursue double majors, and it's so amazing what musicians and creative minds are capable of. But with that, I think comes this high level of perfectionism and striving to achieve, and all before you know it, 4 years is gone, and you miss out on some of the key moments in college. So I always tell people, like take your time, go do a semester study abroad, like enjoy life because it's meant to be enjoyed. As far as um, musicians' health research goes, the good news is that it's basically wide open. There's like there is a lot of research, but not compared to other fields, and you can basically research anything that you want to is the amazing answer.
Mhm.
Um, the when you're in college, like, find a mentor who is already good at research and doing research, and ask if you can bring your voice as a musician into it, because maybe it's something they've never thought about. Like, maybe you could do a population study of how many people at your university have just simply experienced music performance anxiety and what are their coping mechanisms. Or you could do an intervention study of taking one of the tools that I just described and seeing its effectiveness among musicians. I encourage anyone who's interested in the research side of things to look at other fields, look at what engineering is doing, look at what psychology is doing, and bring these innovative techniques into musicians' health research because it really is wide open for you to be able to explore anything that you want to do.
I also plan on, or I want to get a PhD in just like psychology and that too. And a lot of people tell me that I'm really ambitious for wanting these things, but I like to see it as like a positive and just, I just think it's really interesting. And I admire all the work that you've done. And
Thank you.
yeah, I think it's really important for us to be talking about musicians wellness both physically and mentally as they both go hand in hand. My final question for you is, do you think that there are enough mental health resources within the classical music community?
No, but I don't think that there's enough mental health resources for, like, the population at large in general, and especially in the United States because we don't have a universal healthcare system, then right, this brings back to that biopsychosocial model that I was talking about. So it's, does your family have access to good insurance, or do you have the financial resources to afford getting the help you need? Because, like, let's say a musician has gone through something traumatic, they you don't just go to a month of therapy to get over something like that. It often takes years to recover from a traumatic event, and including medical intervention like medicine itself and things like EMDR and talk therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy. And so, like, do you have the resources to tackle that and to go to therapy for years? And a lot of people don't.
Mhm.
So I would love in the future to see more grants available for simply getting musicians the help that they need. That being said, I will give a plug for the the health crisis hotline, which is 988. And I think it's a number that everyone should memorize or have in their phone, because maybe you'll experience a mental health crisis at some point in your life or someone that you know, and being able to have that quick number and get someone there emergently on the line to help walk you through that moment is so, so, so important.
Mhm.
Um, I wanted to go back and touch on one thing that you said about wanting to get a PhD because I think that's so cool and it is so ambitious, but isn't that what life is like us being full
Yeah.
of ambitions and wanting to go for them? And I think the other thing I would tell musicians is, specifically, like, my generation and the generation after, were taught to be like these professional hoop jumpers where one thing is put in front of us and we like it's, okay, can you get into conservatory? Okay, you got into conservatory. Okay, can you get into Aspen? Okay, you got into Aspen. Okay, can you win a professional job? And then you win the professional job and you're like, well, what about all the other things I wanted to do with my life? And so I always encourage musicians, like after my master's, I took 3 years off. I went and lived abroad in Germany. I learned a new language. I traveled the world, and then I got a PhD afterward. And we don't have to constantly jump through hoop after hoop after hoop. So if you want to go study abroad, if you want to go to medical school, if you want to take a year off and learn how to become a professional baker, like do it. Like just do it. It will always be there, and school will always be there, and you can have opportunities a little bit later in life, and life gets so much better if you do that. So that's my final plug is learn how to enjoy life outside of being a musician, because it does make life a little bit richer.
Thank you so much again for doing this interview with me.
Yeah,
If you ever want to do another interview or have any other questions, you can just feel free to contact me.
for sure.
Yeah, if you want to learn more about Classically Imperfect, make sure to click the link in our bio. Thank you. Bye.